The email had arrived 3 days after my last final, a digital ghost in the otherwise silent inbox of my university account. It was from him, Professor Alastair Finch. The subject line was a simple, maddeningly neutral phrase, final paper. My heart had performed a frantic, clumsy pirouette against my ribs. For 72 hours, I had opened and closed the message, reading the same 2 sentences until the black letters seemed to blur into meaningless shapes. Leo, I'd like to discuss your analysis of Caravaggio's chiaroscuro. Please come by my office hours on Friday at 2. Finch, Friday. That was today. My life, for the past 4 months, had been a study in quiet observation. From the back row of Art History 304, the Baroque period, I had watched him. I had learned the geography of his being the way other students learned the names of Italian patrons. I knew the way his salt and pepper hair curled just behind his ears when he'd been lecturing for a while. The way he'd push his silver-framed glasses up the bridge of his nose with one long finger, a gesture of thoughtful punctuation. I knew the sound of his shoes on the worn linoleum of the lecture hall, a steady, confident cadence that announced his arrival before he even entered the room. He favored dark gray suits, tailored just so, and the occasional tweed jacket that made him look less like a professor and more like a character from a novel I'd want to live in. He smelled of old books and something else, something subtle and clean, like bergamot and cedar. I'd only been close enough to catch it once, when I'd stayed after class to ask a question I already knew the answer to, just for the chance to stand within his orbit for a few precious seconds. The memory of that scent had clung to me for the rest of the day, a phantom presence that made my own small apartment feel even emptier. Now, I stood outside his office door, the polished brass plate reading Dr. A. Finch, and my reflection was a pale, distorted stranger. My hand, hovering over the heavy oak, trembled slightly. This was absurd. He was a professor. I was a student. He was, by all public accounts, a straight, widowed academic who lived a quiet, solitary life. I was a 21-year-old mess of anxieties and unspoken desires, a boy who had spent an entire semester weaving elaborate fantasies around the way a man discussed the dramatic interplay of light and shadow in a 17th-century painting. He wanted to talk about my paper. That was all. My paper, into which I had poured every ounce of my longing, transmuting my obsession with him into an academic analysis of Caravaggio. I wrote about the tension in the shadows, the desperate reach of a hand out of the darkness, the stark, brutal illumination of a single moment of truth. I had written about the artist, but I had been thinking of the professor. Perhaps he'd seen through it. Perhaps he thought it was brilliant. Or, more likely, perhaps he thought it was unprofessional, overwrought, and was about to tell me he'd had to dock my grade for excessive romanticism. The thought sent a fresh wave of nausea through me. Taking a breath that did little to calm the hummingbird trapped in my chest, I knocked. The sound was too loud in the silent hallway. The semester was over. The building was a hollow shell, populated only by a few lingering faculty and the ghosts of frantic, pre-exam students. "Come in," a voice called from within. It was his voice. Low, calm, resonant. It was the voice that had narrated my dreams for months. I turned the cool brass knob and pushed the door open. And there he was. Professor Finch's office was exactly as I had imagined it, and yet so much more. Bookshelves lined every wall, crammed from floor to ceiling not just with academic texts, but with worn paperbacks, art monographs, and leather-bound volumes that looked ancient. A slant of late afternoon sun cut through the tall, mullioned window, illuminating a universe of dust motes dancing in the air. It smelled like I'd imagined, too. Paper, old wood, the faint aroma of brewing coffee, and that clean, subtle scent that was uniquely his. He was not behind his large mahogany desk, as I'd expected. He was standing by the window, looking out over the manicured green of the campus quad. He turned as I entered, and his eyes found mine. They were a cool, intelligent gray, and for a moment, they held an expression I couldn't decipher. It wasn't annoyance, it wasn't academic curiosity. It was something quieter, more watchful. "Leo," he said, his voice softer than it was in the lecture hall. "Thank you for coming." Of course, Professor, my own voice sounded thin, reedy. I cleared my throat and closed the door behind me, the soft click echoing in the stillness. He gestured to one of the 2 leather armchairs in front of his desk. Please. I sat, my backpack sliding from my shoulder to the floor with a soft thud. He remained standing by the window for another long moment, his silhouette framed by the golden light. I watched the way the light caught the silver in his hair, turning it into a halo. He was taller than he seemed from the back of the lecture hall, with broad shoulders that the tweed jacket did little to conceal. He moved with an unhurried grace, a quiet economy of motion that I found endlessly captivating. Finally, he moved away from the window and rounded the desk, but he didn't sit down. Instead, he leaned against the front of it, crossing his arms over his chest. The position was casual, but the proximity was not. He was only a few feet away, close enough that I had to tilt my head back slightly to meet his gaze. It created an immediate, unnerving shift in our dynamic. This was not a professor addressing a student from behind the fortress of his desk. This was something else entirely. "Your paper," he began, his gray eyes fixed on mine. It was remarkable. Relief washed over me, so potent it almost made me dizzy. "Oh, thank you. I really connected with the material." A small smile touched the corner of his mouth. It was a subtle thing, but on his usually serious face, it was like a crack of lightning. "So I gathered. You wrote about Caravaggio's use of darkness not as an absence of light, but as an active presence. A character in the painting. A force that shapes the narrative, that hides and reveals. You called it a tangible void." "Yes," I nodded, my confidence buoyed by his words. I feel like, for him, the darkness was as important as the figures he was illuminating. It's what gives them their weight, their desperation. He nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving my face. It was an intense, unnerving level of focus. In a class of 200, I had been anonymous. Here, in the quiet of his office, I felt scrutinized, seen in a way that was both terrifying and thrilling. "You have a keen eye, Leo," he said. He pushed off the desk and walked over to one of the bookshelves. He ran a hand along the spines, the gesture slow and deliberate. I watched his fingers, the clean, trimmed nails, the slight prominence of the knuckles. Every small detail of him seemed magnified in the charged silence of the room. He pulled out a large, heavy book and carried it back to the desk. He laid it open, the thick pages whispering as they settled. "Come here," he said, his voice quiet. It was not a request. My legs felt unsteady as I stood and walked the few steps to his side. The space behind the desk was his territory, and I was now an intruder in it. The scent of him was stronger here, a warm, clean mix of paper and cedar and man. It filled my head, making it hard to think. He was standing close beside me, our shoulders almost touching. I could feel the heat radiating from his body. He pointed a long finger at a reproduction in the book. It was Caravaggio's The Calling of St. Matthew. "Here," he said, his voice a low murmur near my ear. "Look at the hand of Christ. Almost a direct copy of Adam's in the Sistine Chapel. But look at the light. It doesn't illuminate Christ. It follows his gesture, striking Matthew, the tax collector. The sinner, sitting in the darkness, counting his money." I stared at the page, but I wasn't really seeing the painting. I was acutely aware of his proximity. His arm brushed against mine as he leaned closer. I could hear the soft sound of his breathing. My own breath was trapped in my lungs. I am here, in his office, standing beside him. He is so close. The thoughts looped, a frantic, repetitive prayer. "The divine light," he continued, his voice dropping even lower, "doesn't come from a divine source. It comes from a mundane window, high and out of frame. It's a real light, a profane light, carrying a sacred message. Do you see the tension in that?" "Yes," I managed to whisper, my throat tight. It's making the sacred real. Tangible." "Exactly." He straightened up, but he didn't move away. He turned his head slightly, and I found myself caught in his gaze. We were inches apart. I could see the fine lines around his eyes, the faint shadow of stubble on his jaw. His eyes searched mine, and that unreadable expression was back, more intense this time. It felt as though he were looking for something, an answer to a question he hadn't asked. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, a wild, desperate rhythm. This is it. This is the moment. My mind, my body, everything was screaming. But what was it? A moment of academic connection? A simple, shared appreciation for art? Or was it the precipice of something else, something I had only dared to imagine in the lonely quiet of my own room? He held my gaze for what felt like an eternity. The world seemed to shrink until it was only the space between us, thick with unspoken things. The dust motes continued their silent dance in the sunbeam. The old clock on his wall ticked, a steady, measured heartbeat that was the complete opposite of my own. Then, he did something that shattered the world. He lifted his hand, slowly, and gently placed it on the side of my neck, his thumb coming to rest just below my ear, on the frantic pulse point there. His touch was warm and firm. It was not a casual gesture. It was deliberate, possessive. My breath hitched. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. I could only feel the warmth of his skin against mine, the slight roughness of his thumb as it stroked my pulse, as if calming a frightened animal. "You feel more than just an academic appreciation for this, don't you, Leo?" he murmured, his voice a low vibration that seemed to travel from his hand directly into my soul. His gray eyes were dark now, searching, intense. The tension, the darkness, the longing for a single, illuminating touch. I couldn't speak. I could only stare at him, my own longing reflected in his eyes, a truth so stark and overwhelming it felt like one of Caravaggio's paintings. The sinner, caught in a beam of impossible light. He knew. Somehow he knew. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. His thumb continued its slow, hypnotic movement against my pulse. It was the only thing keeping me anchored to reality. Without it, I think I would have floated away, dissolved into the dusty, sunlit air of his office. He was reading my every reaction. I knew it. He saw the slight parting of my lips, the widening of my eyes, the way my breath trembled. He saw it all, and he didn't look away. This is present tense. This is happening now. I am not imagining it. His hand is on my neck. His eyes are on my face. The scent of him is all around me. My body is a live wire, humming with a current I have suppressed for so long. He's waiting for an answer, but the question he asked wasn't really a question at all. It was a statement, an acknowledgement. He wasn't asking if I felt it. He was telling me that he knew I did. My gaze dropped from his eyes to his mouth. A mistake. A terrible, wonderful mistake. His lips were thin, serious, but there was a softness to them I hadn't noticed from the back of the lecture hall. I wondered what they would feel like. The thought was a sudden, sharp shock, and I felt a flush creep up my neck, a betraying heat that I was sure he could feel beneath his palm. A ghost of a smile returned to his lips. He had seen it. He had seen the thought as clearly as if I had spoken it aloud. He wasn't pulling away. If anything, the pressure of his hand increased, just slightly, drawing me infinitesimally closer. "Alistair," he said. His voice was barely a whisper, a rustle of dry leaves. It took my brain a moment to process the word. Alistair. His name. Not Professor Finch. Alistair. He was giving me his name, a key to a door I never thought I'd be allowed to approach, let alone open. Alistair. I repeated, the name feeling foreign and yet perfectly right on my tongue. It tasted like hope. His eyes softened. The intense scrutiny was replaced by something else, something warmer, something that looked impossibly like relief. He had been taking a risk, too. I hadn't even considered that. I had been so wrapped up in my own fear and desire, I hadn't seen his. The thought was staggering. This man, this confident, brilliant, self-possessed man, had been just as uncertain as I was. He let out a slow breath, his chest rising and falling. His gaze flickered down to my mouth, then back up to my eyes. The silent question was there again, but this time it was different. It wasn't a test. It was an invitation. And I, who had spent a lifetime in the shadows, was finally ready to step into the light. I gave the slightest of nods, a barely perceptible movement, but he saw it. His eyes closed for a brief second, and when they opened again, the last of his academic reserve was gone. He was just a man looking at another man with a hunger that mirrored my own. He leaned in, closing the final inch between us. His movements were still unhurried, giving me every chance to pull away. I didn't. I couldn't have, even if I wanted to. I leaned in to meet him, my eyes fluttering shut. The first touch of his lips was soft, tentative. It was a question. It was a breath of warmth against my mouth, a moment of impossible stillness. Then, as I responded, pressing back gently, the kiss deepened. It was not a frantic, desperate thing. It was slow, deliberate, a deep and thorough exploration. It tasted of coffee and clean air and something that was just him, just Alistair. His hand moved from my neck to cradle the back of my head, his fingers tangling in my hair, holding me to him. My own hands, which had been hanging uselessly at my sides, came up to rest on his chest. I could feel the steady, solid beat of his heart beneath my palm, a rhythm that was surprisingly calm, so different from the frantic panic in my own chest. It was everything. It was the answer to a question I hadn't known how to ask. It was the culmination of 4 months of silent yearning, of watching from afar, of pouring my heart into an essay about a long-dead painter because I couldn't speak it to the man standing in front of me. It was a single, illuminating touch in the darkness. When he finally pulled back, we were both breathless. He didn't move far. Our foreheads rested together, his hand still tangled in my hair. I kept my eyes closed, trying to commit every sensation to memory. The warmth of his skin, the slight scrape of his stubble against my own, the lingering taste of him on my lips. "Leo," he breathed, his voice thick. I opened my eyes. His were already open, watching me with a raw vulnerability that stole my breath. The professor was gone. The impenetrable, stoic academic had vanished. In his place was Alistair, and his eyes were full of 1,000 emotions I couldn't begin to name. "I've wanted to do that," he said, his voice low and raspy, "since the day you stayed after class to ask me about Bernini's Ecstasy of St. Teresa." My mind reeled back. That was in February, the second week of the semester. I had been a nervous wreck, my question clumsy, my hands shaking. I thought he'd found me foolish, another starstruck student. But he had been seeing me. All this time, when I thought I was invisible, he had been watching me, too. The realization was a seismic shock, rearranging the entire landscape of my recent past. All those stolen glances across the lecture hall, the moments I thought were my own private secret, they hadn't been. They had been a silent conversation. I didn't know. I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. "I know," he said, a faint, wry smile touching his lips. "I'm a very private man, Leo. And we're my student. The lines are not meant to be crossed." "But the semester is over," I said, the words rushing out, a plea and a statement of fact all at once. "Yes," he said, his thumb stroking the back of my head. "The semester is over." The silence that followed was different. The tension was gone, replaced by a fragile, shimmering sense of possibility. But there was awkwardness, too. The morning after feeling, even though it was only mid-afternoon. What now? We had crossed a line, yes, but into what? A momentary indiscretion in a dusty office? A terrible mistake? My inherent anxiety began to bubble up, a cold counterpoint to the warmth that had bloomed in my chest. I felt a sudden, desperate need for reassurance. As if sensing the shift in my mood, Alistair took a small step back, though his hand remained on my head, a warm, grounding presence. He looked at me, his expression serious again. "This was not my intention when I asked you to come here today," he said, his voice steady. "My intention was to talk to you about your paper, to tell you that you have a singular talent, and perhaps to find a way to see you again, outside of these walls. Once my grades were submitted and you were no longer my student," he let out a short, self-deprecating sigh. I appear to have lost my patience. My heart swelled with a feeling so potent it hurt. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an impulse. It was considered, planned, even. The thought was dizzying. "You wanted to see me again?" I asked, needing to hear it said plainly. "Very much," he confirmed, his gaze unwavering. "I found your insights in class compelling. And I found your presence." He paused, searching for the word. "Distracting." A small, shaky laugh escaped me. "I was distracting." "Profoundly," he said, and the corner of his mouth twitched again. "It is very difficult to lecture on the Counter-Reformation when a young man in the back row is staring at you with the intensity of Bernini sculpting marble." The flush returned to my cheeks with a vengeance. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "Don't be." He cut me off gently. It was not unwelcome. He finally let his hand fall from my hair, and the loss of contact was immediate and sharp. I felt suddenly adrift. He must have seen it in my face, because he took my hand, his long fingers lacing through mine. It was a simple gesture, but it felt more intimate, more binding, than the kiss. A kiss could be a moment of passion, a fleeting thing. Holding hands felt like a promise. His palm was warm and dry against mine, his grip firm and reassuring. He led me away from the desk, toward the 2 leather armchairs. "Sit with me for a moment," he said. We sat, not opposite each other as before, but side by side, still holding hands. The late afternoon light was growing richer, casting long shadows across the room. The office felt like a sanctuary, a pocket of the world where the rules didn't apply. But they did. I knew they did. The test would be stepping outside that door. Alistair, I began, my voice hesitant. What does this mean? He turned his head to look at me, his expression sober. It means I have been unprofessional. It means I have put you in a complicated position. No, I said quickly, squeezing his hand. You haven't. This is what I wanted. More than I let myself admit. He studied my face for a long moment. Then he gave a slow nod. Good. That is a relief to hear. He looked down at our joined hands, then back at me. It means, I hope, that this is the start of a conversation. One that has nothing to do with art history. He released my hand and stood up, walking back over to his desk. For a terrifying second, I thought he was dismissing me, that the moment was over. But he only picked up a pen and a small piece of notepaper. He scribbled something on it, and then came back, holding it out to me. It was his personal phone number. My grades are officially submitted tomorrow at noon, he said, his tone back to its familiar, measured cadence, but his eyes held a new warmth. After that, I am no longer your professor. I am just Alistair. And Alistair would very much like to take Leo to dinner on Saturday, somewhere far away from this campus. If Leo is interested. I took the paper from him, my fingers brushing his. The paper was warm from his touch. I looked at the strong, black ink of his handwriting, his name, his number. A tangible piece of evidence that this was real. I'm interested, I said, my voice steadier now. Leo is very interested. A genuine smile broke across his face then, and it transformed him. The serious, reserved professor vanished, replaced by a man who looked younger, his face illuminated with a startling joy. It was like seeing the sun come out from behind a cloud. Good, he said simply. The conscious choice had been made. The offer was on the table. It was my turn to accept it, to step into this new reality with him. We stood there for a moment longer, the space between us filled with a quiet understanding. The path forward was uncertain, fraught with potential complications, but for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel afraid. I felt seen. I finally found the strength to move, to gather my things. I slid the precious slip of paper into my wallet, as if it were a winning lottery ticket. I shouldered my backpack, the weight of it feeling different now, lighter. I should go, I said, though I didn't want to. I wanted to stay in the golden light of this office forever. Yes, he agreed, though his eyes said he felt the same way. He walked me to the door. As I reached for the handle, he placed his hand on the small of my back. It was a light touch, just the briefest pressure through the fabric of my shirt, but it was electric. It was a gesture of guidance, of possession, of promise. A silent reassurance that what happened in this room was not the end, but the beginning. Saturday, he said, his voice a low murmur. I'll wait for your call. I'll call, I promised. Then I was out in the empty hallway, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind me. I stood there for a full minute, my back pressed against the cool wood, my heart still racing. I brought my fingers to my lips. They still felt warm, still tasted faintly of him. The walk across campus was surreal. The world looked the same, but it was entirely different. The late sun on the grass, the distant sound of a lawnmower, the familiar shape of the library tower. It was all imbued with a new, vibrant meaning. I was no longer an observer, a ghost haunting the edges of my own life. I was a participant. I had been seen, and I had been chosen. I thought about the past 4 months. The hours spent in the library, ostensibly studying, but really just rereading his published articles, trying to glean some insight into the man behind the words. The careful, calculated outfits I wore to his lectures, hoping to catch his eye. The way my heart would leap when he would read a particularly poignant passage, his voice giving the words a weight and beauty they didn't possess on the page. I had thought it was all one-sided, a secret, unrequited obsession. But it had been a dialogue all along, and I had just been too afraid to hear his side of the conversation. He had called my presence distracting. He'd noticed my stare. He had wanted to kiss me since February. The thoughts were a dizzying, joyful cascade. The architecture of my loneliness, so carefully constructed over the years, was crumbling. When I got back to my apartment, the first thing I did was pull the piece of paper from my wallet. I stared at the number. Alastair Finch. His name next to a string of digits that connected him to the world outside the university. It was the most exciting, terrifying thing I had ever held. I spent the next 24 hours in a state of suspended animation. I ate without tasting. I read without comprehending. My entire being was focused on a single point in the future, tomorrow at noon. The official end of my status as a student. The official beginning of whatever this was. The fear tried to creep back in. What if he changed his mind? What if this was a lapse in judgment he would come to regret? He was an established, respected academic. I was just a student. A nobody. The old narrative of my own insignificance was a powerful one. But then I would remember the feeling of his hand on my neck, the vulnerability in his eyes after he kissed me, the firm, reassuring grip of his hand in mine. Those were real. They were a stronger narrative. The next morning, I watched the clock on my phone, the numbers changing with excruciating slowness. 11:58, 11:59. My thumb hovered over the call button next to his name, which I had already programmed into my contacts under Alastair. Not Professor Finch. The distinction felt monumental. At precisely 12:01, my phone buzzed in my hand. It wasn't me making the call. It was him. A text message. My heart hammered against my ribs as I opened it. The grades are in. You earned your A. A beat passed. Then a second message appeared. And I am officially no longer your professor. Is that dinner invitation still open? A giddy, breathless laugh escaped me. He hadn't waited. He had been watching the clock, too. The knowledge sent a fresh wave of warmth through me, chasing away the last of my doubts. I typed back, my fingers clumsy. It is. Very open. Good. Shall I pick you up at 7? We made the arrangements, the exchange of messages simple, logistical, but underneath each word was the thrum of excitement, of a shared secret. When I gave him my address, I felt a jolt of intimacy. He would know where I lived. He would see my small, unremarkable apartment building. He would be a part of my world. The rest of the day was a blur of nervous energy. I cleaned my already clean apartment. I tried on 3 different outfits before settling on the first one. I stared at myself in the mirror, trying to see what he saw. I still just saw Leo. Awkward, quiet Leo. But maybe, just maybe, there was something else there that I was finally starting to see myself. At exactly 7 o'clock, there was a knock on my door. Not a text message saying he was outside. A knock. He had come up. He was standing right on the other side of the door. I took a deep breath, my hand on the knob. This was another threshold. Leaving his office was one thing. Letting him into my home, my life, was another. I opened the door. And there he was. Alastair. He wasn't wearing a suit or a tweed jacket. He was in dark jeans, a crisp navy blue button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, and leather boots. He looked casual, younger, more real than he had ever looked on campus. He was holding a single bottle of wine. "Hi," he said, and his smile was a little hesitant, a little nervous. It was endearing. "Hi," I breathed. "Come in." He stepped inside, and my small apartment seemed to shrink around him. His presence was so large, so solid. He looked around the living room, at my stacks of books, the cheap print of a Rothko painting on the wall, the worn-out sofa. I felt a sudden pang of self-consciousness. It was nothing like his office, that curated world of intellect and history. This was just a place where a student lived. "It's nice," he said, his voice sincere. He met my eyes. "It's you." And in that moment, I understood. He wasn't judging my apartment. He was seeing me. He was learning me, the same way I had spent months learning him. The dinner was at a small Italian restaurant across town, a place with checkered tablecloths and candles in Chianti bottles. It was a world away from the hallowed halls of the university. And the conversation was, too. We didn't talk about art history, not once. We talked about everything else. He asked me about my family, about where I grew up, about my plans after graduation. And he answered my questions in return. I learned that he was from a small town in Oregon, that his late wife had been a botanist, that he had spent 2 years living in Florence when he was my age, and that he had a terrible weakness for bad science fiction movies. He was a person, a whole, complex, funny, and sometimes sad person. And as the evening went on, the intimidating figure of Professor Finch faded completely, leaving only Alastair, a man I was growing to like even more than the fantasy I had created. He was an attentive listener, his gray eyes focused on me as I spoke. making me feel like the most interesting person in the world. He had a dry, witty sense of humor that emerged in unexpected moments, making me laugh out loud. And there were moments when our hands brushed as we both reached for the breadbasket, or when his knee pressed against mine under the small table, that a jolt of electricity would pass between us, a reminder of the fire that had been lit in his office. When he drove me home, a comfortable silence settled between us. He parked the car, but didn't turn off the engine. The test. The end of the night. What happens now? I had a really nice time, Alistair, I said, my voice quiet in the confines of the car. As did I, Leo, he said. He turned to look at me, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the dashboard lights. More than I have in a very long time. He didn't make a move. He was waiting. He was giving me the control, letting me set the pace. It was a gesture of respect that meant more to me than he could ever know. He had crossed the line in his office, but now, out here in the real world, he was making sure we were crossing them together. I leaned across the console and kissed him. It was different from the first time. It was softer, more certain. It was not a kiss of sudden combustion, but of quiet confirmation. When I pulled back, he was smiling. Can I see you again? I asked. I was hoping you'd ask, he said. Tomorrow. Tomorrow, I agreed. The days that followed blurred into a week, then two. We fell into a rhythm that felt both thrillingly new and deeply familiar. We went for long walks, explored dusty used bookstores, and yes, we watched a terribly bad science fiction movie from the 70s, providing our own sarcastic commentary. He came over to my apartment for dinner, and I went over to his house, a beautiful old craftsman filled with even more books than his office, and a garden his wife had planted that he still tended with a quiet devotion. It was in that house that I truly began to understand him. It was a place of quiet memories and comfortable solitude. He had lived alone for a long time, and I realized that my loneliness had called out to his. We were two solitary people who had found a shared space. One evening, we were sitting on his back porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. A comfortable silence had fallen between us, the only sounds the chirping of crickets and the clinking of ice in our glasses. What are you thinking about? He asked softly. I looked at him, at the way the fading light caught the silver in his hair, the peaceful, contented expression on his face. I'm thinking about your office, I admitted. About that day. He turned his head to look at me, his gray eyes soft. What about it? Were you scared? I asked. When you touched me, were you scared I would pull away? Or worse? He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. Terrified, he finally said, his voice low. I hadn't felt anything like that for anyone in over a decade. I thought I was past it. And then you walked into my classroom. You were so quiet, so observant. And when you looked at me, I felt seen, in a way I hadn't realized I'd missed so desperately. He reached out and took my hand, his fingers lacing through mine. I broke every rule in the book that day, Leo. My professional ethics, my own personal code of conduct. But I would do it again. In a heartbeat. I squeezed his hand, my heart aching with a beautiful, overwhelming emotion. It was more than just a crush. It was more than desire. It was this quiet moment on a porch, hands intertwined, two solitary souls finding a home in each other. I'm glad you did, I whispered. He brought my hand to his lips and pressed a soft kiss to my knuckles. Me too. That night, I stayed. I slept in his bed, wrapped in his arms, the scent of him all around me. It was a sleep deeper and more peaceful than any I had ever known. There was no pretense, no performance. Just the simple, profound intimacy of two people choosing to be together in the quiet dark. Waking up the next morning, with the early light filtering through the window and the weight of his arm draped over my waist, felt like the first day of the rest of my life. I lay there for a long time, just watching him sleep. The stern lines of his face were softened, his expression peaceful. In sleep, he looked vulnerable. He was not the imposing Professor Finch, nor the confident Alistair. He was just a man. My man. The thought sent a thrill through me, a feeling of rightness that settled deep in my bones. This was real. This was happening. It wasn't a fantasy I had concocted in the back of a lecture hall. It was the quiet intimacy of a Sunday morning, the sound of his steady breathing, the warmth of his body next to mine. I thought back to the boy I was just a few weeks ago, standing nervously outside his office door, convinced I was about to be reprimanded for a paper that was more a confession than an analysis. I had felt so small then, so invisible. My world had been one of longing from a distance, of observing life rather than living it. Alistair had changed all that. He hadn't just seen me. He had pulled me out of the shadows and into the light. His light. It wasn't the harsh, interrogating light of a Caravaggio painting, but something softer, warmer. A dawn. He stirred beside me, his eyes fluttering open. He blinked a few times, a faint, sleepy confusion on his face, and then his gaze focused on me. A slow, warm smile spread across his lips. "Good morning," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. "Morning," I whispered back. He tightened his arm around me, pulling me closer until my head was resting on his chest. I could feel the rumble of his voice as he spoke. I could get used to this. I smiled against his skin. Me too. We lay there in a comfortable silence, listening to the world wake up outside. It was a simple, domestic moment, but it felt more significant than any grand romantic gesture. This was the new beginning. Not the first kiss in the office, not the first date, but this. The quiet, unpretentious start of a shared day. I realized my journey hadn't been about moving from loneliness to love. It had been about moving from observation to participation. For so long, I had been the audience to my own life. Alistair hadn't just invited me on stage. He had shown me that I belonged there all along. He hadn't rescued me. He had simply held up a mirror and shown me the person who was worthy of being seen. He tilted my chin up with his finger, his gray eyes searching mine. "What are you thinking about now?" he asked. I didn't have to hesitate. I didn't have to translate my feelings into a metaphor about Baroque art. I could just speak the truth. "I'm thinking," I said, my voice full of a certainty that was brand new, "that I feel like I've come home." His smile was all the answer I needed.